particular video we're going to look at the costs of the firm, but in order to understand the cost curves you've got to start by looking at what we call the production function and what happens when you add more factors of production to a firm, to their costs and to their output. So remember the four factors of production. They are labour, and they get a wage; capital, the return is interest; land, which gets rent; and enterprise, which gets profit. So the key thing here is that you add some factors of production, they're going to give you some more output, and that then adds to costs, because the factors of production are going to cost you. They're going to cost you wages, interest, rent and profit. So there's a link between how much we add to the factors and how much output they give us. Then we get to costs, and then at that point we can get to what we're really trying to get to at the end, which is the cost per unit of output. Okay, so this bit here, factor of production turning into output, of course, is known as productivity. So that's quite important that you pick up that idea. Okay, all right. So the costs of firms, the production function simply is how do we change the output by changing the amount of factors that the firm will employ. And the usual form of a production function is the output is some function of the amount of land and labour and capital and enterprise. Now, you've got to make sure that you don't confuse the production, which is the output of the firm, and the productivity, which is the output per unit of one of those things: capital, labour, etc. Okay, and it's also, in this section of the course, you've got to remember to define the short and the long run. So the short run in any time period where at least one of those factors is fixed. It can't change in the short run. Okay, the fixed means the cost does not change with output. Okay, so in other words, when the output changes, the cost of the factor does not change, but it doesn't mean that it will never change. Okay, so it's just that it doesn't change with output, and that's really quite important when you get to this. And also the short run, the assumption we tend to make is that the amount of machinery capital is fixed, and the firms just increase output by increasing labour, which we call the variable factor. But you could have other variable factors. You could have workers, which is labour; raw materials, they're all variable because they will all change when output changes. Okay, the fixed factors are things like loans and admin staff, because they don't change with output. Okay, so it's key that you get the idea they don't change with output. The long run, if the short run is defined as any period in at least one factor is fixed, and this is what we're going to be looking at now, the long run is a period in which all factors can be changed, or all factors become variable. Okay, so from now on in the video we're talking about the short run where at least one factor is fixed. Okay, so let's get the product sorted out. The product is simply the output that is produced, and there's three different things that we need to look at. We need to look at the total output. When we use all the factors, what is the total output, the total product of the firm? The average, which is the total divided by the variable factor, how many variable factors I've got, and then the margin, which is the change in the total when I employ one more, could be one less as well, variable factor. Okay, so simple table here. You've got your factors, you've got labour, 10, 11, 12, so I add some more labour to my firm. What happens to my output? Total product goes up and up. Average is the output divided by the number of factors, so 50 divided by 10, 66 divided by 11, and there's the average product. And the marginal product is the change here in your total product, the change divided by the change in the number of factors. So one more in this case gives me 30 more. So that's the marginal product. Okay, we now have to look at the what we call the law of diminishing returns. So by returns, what we mean is how much output the returns, how much output can be gained by the firm from employing one more of the factors of production. So returns is, as I say, an output concept. And there's a law of diminishing returns, and it says this, that as you add more and more of that variable factor to a fixed factor, capital, okay, what is likely to happen initially is that the amount produced by each unit of the variable factor starts to rise. That's because as you add more and more labour, then those workers can start to specialise, and specialise will increase their productivity. But after a while, each of those factors is fighting each other to use the fixed amount of capital, the fixed machinery in the business. So in the end, what is going to happen is that the amount that you get from each of those factors is going to decline. Okay, so it does go up initially, but in the end it declines. Here it is in a table. I'm just adding the factors here, one more factor each time. The total product goes up, but the marginal product goes up initially. So initially here, this is a time when the factors are starting to specialize, and so in the first one I'm getting an extra 5 from them. The second worker, I'm actually getting an extra 9 units of output from them, up to 14 now. So the marginal product will rise to start with, but then eventually it will start to fall. And if you work out the average product, then the average product will be the total divided by the workers. And again, the average will rise initially to here, but then eventually, because these marginals, the marginal product is pushing down and pulling it down, the average eventually comes down. And the relationship between marginal and average is a really important one that you've got to get in this section of the course. So let's have a look. The law of diminishing returns, there's two types. There's diminishing marginal returns, which we'll look at here, and then we'll look at diminishing average returns. The law of diminishing marginal returns shows that as you add more of the variable factor, initially what's going to happen is the marginal product will rise, then it starts to fall, and at some stage it might even become negative. So you draw this with a rising marginal product as you increase the variable factor. Be careful, this is the units of the variable factor on this axis, and this is output, which is different in a minute. But when I add my variable factors in, marginal product rises, then marginal product falls, and then it becomes negative. Okay? Now, what about then the total product? So if we know what's happened to the marginal product, initially the total product will rise at an increasing rate. Marginal product is rising, so the total product will be rising at an increasing rate. Then marginal product starts to fall, but it's still positive. So the total is still going up, but it's going up at a decreasing rate. And then if marginal product becomes negative, it'll start to cause total to go down. So you'll see that in these diagrams here, okay, where marginal product is rising, so the total is going up, but it's going up at a faster rate. But as soon as your marginal starts to fall, the total, still positive marginal, so it's adding to the total, but the total is increasing at a decreasing rate. And it's only when marginal falls that your total, falls to below zero, that your total starts to fall. Never really use that in the exam. Sometimes that can be used in multi-choice work. Okay. All right. What about diminishing average returns? So we've done marginal. As I say, the average product goes up and then it starts to go down. Law of diminishing returns. Here it is. Basically, the average product will start to rise and then it will start to fall. Okay, so as you add more and more of these variable factors, your average product is rising, then your average product is falling. Now, the key thing here is that the marginal product goes up and then it comes down, and the marginal product will always cut the average product at the top point, the maximum point of the average product. And that's like any sport that you play. Let's say you play hockey, and your average gets goals in a game is 8. If the marginal, you play another game and it's above 8, it's going to bring your average up. If, however, your average was 8, and then the next time you played you only got 2, it's going to bring your average down. So it's a really important relationship between average and marginal. And the thing that people get wrong is that they say if the average is rising, if the marginal is rising. That's not true. Okay, so you've got to make sure you understand that the average rises when the marginal is above it. The average falls when the marginal is below it. So initially your marginal product rises, brings up your average, then it falls, but it's still positive. So average product starts to rise, but then eventually the average product will come down. But the key relationship is if the margin is above the average will rise. If the margin's below the average will fall. So that's really key in this diagram and in the cost diagram that we're going to come on to. Okay, so if we've got this understanding then of adding more factors and changing output, how is it going to change the costs? Because that's what we're heading for. That's what we've got to do in this. Okay, so in order to work out the cost, you have to consider that production function and see how the output, the production of those factors changes as you add more factors. And one underlying assumption is that when I add the factors, the cost of employing them is the same. Okay, it's constant. So I pay every factor I bring into my firm the same wage rate as the previous factors. So each additional factor will add to the costs by those wages. Those factors will increase output, and then because I've got output and I've got costs, I can work out the cost per unit of output, per 1 unit of output. So example, my 15th worker here, I'm paying them £20 an hour. Okay, they increase output by 40. So the extra cost of the worker is 20, the extra output is 40, so the cost for one of those units of output is going to be 50p, because 40 costs me £20. So 1 would cost me 20 divided by 40, half a pound, 50p. If, however, I add my 16th and they increase the output by 30, I'm still paying them this £20, remember, then all that we're saying then is that the cost of the unit is going to go up to 67p, because they've given me 30, costs me 20, so how much does 1 cost me? 30 divided by 30, I've got to take 20 divided by 30 to get my 67. So hopefully you can see that as the marginal product has fallen, the average cost has risen. Okay, and that's an important relationship that you've got to get. So what do they look like? Well, we need to think about these 3 things: total cost, average cost, and marginal cost, same as we did with product. Okay, the total costs are now split into the fixed and the variable costs. So fixed costs, variable costs. So in terms of those total costs, there's 3 different diagrams, and these are really used most often in multi-choice, not in your essay work, but you need to know them. The fixed costs, remember here, they do not change with output. So it doesn't matter what happens to the output, the fixed cost stays the same. The variable cost, this is the total variable cost, remember, starts at 0. If I don't produce anything, I don't have any variable cost, and they go up. Remember I said you're going to add the same amount of wage each time I employ a worker, add £20, add £20, add £20. So to get to your total costs, you've got to combine these 2 diagrams. Remember, this one is starting here and this one is starting here. So this is the diagram. It's a bit of a difficult one to get to, but all you've got to do, draw in your total variable costs, draw in your fixed costs, and then add those two curves vertically. So let's take a quantity here. I know that those are my fixed costs, those are my variable costs, so on top of the fixed costs, that red arrow is the same height as that red arrow, because that's the variable costs, so I get my total costs. Exactly the same here. Here's my total fixed costs, here's my variable, so this arrow and this arrow are the same height. I add on top of the fixed cost the variables to get to my total costs. So those are the fixed and the variable added together. So the total cost is going to start here, and it's going to go up at the same slope as the variable costs. What about average? And these are the things that you really need to know for building your models. So the average total cost is going to be the total cost divided by the units of output. So it's total cost divided by quantity of output. Remember, when we were doing the product, it was the quantity of the variable factor. We're now switching. This is the quantity of the firm. So total costs comprise the fixed and the variables. So there they are. The average total is the average fixed and the average variable cost. So we've got to look at both of those. So the average fixed cost is going to be the, here it is, it's downward sloping, and it never turns up. And the reason for that is that what you're saying is the fixed cost is fixed, is a fixed number. If you divide this fixed number by a small number here, okay, you're going to get very large average fixed costs over here. But as you divide that fixed number by an ever increasing quantity, the average fixed cost is going to come down. Okay, so as output rises, the fixed costs continually fall because you're just dividing that fixed sum by an ever increasing quantity. So example for you there, average fixed costs will be 100 if the fixed costs are 100, because I've only got one output. When I get two outputs, I'm dividing that by 2, and so the average fixed costs are going to go down. In addition, when you look at it, you can see that the area under the curve, because if that's area of the, if that point there on this axis is the average fixed cost and that's the quantity, the area under the curve is going to be a constant, and it's going to be the total fixed costs. So again, sometimes that's needed in multi-choice work. What about the variable cost? So this is where we get to the crux of why did I have to build up all that stuff about the product. So the law of diminishing returns is the reason for the shape of the variable cost curve in the short run. Okay, when the average product curve is rising, average output of the workers is rising, cost is the same, that's going to mean that the variable cost is falling. Okay, so we'll see it here. As the average product is rising, what we'll find is that the average variable cost should be falling. When the average product starts to fall, we will find that the average variable will start to rise. So there's two areas. The average product is rising, but I'm still paying the workers the same. So the average variable cost is going to go down. Okay, so every worker I start to employ, increase my number of workers, their average productivity goes up. So that means the cost of producing one good, the average variable cost, goes down. And so there's a relationship between where this peaks and where that is at its bottom point. Okay, hopefully that's helpful. Dreadful diagram. Don't ever have to use it, so don't worry. All you've got to do then is to take those averages and say, well, look, if this here is the average fixed cost and this is the average variable cost, I've got to add them together. So over this range here, A, okay, the average total cost is falling over this range, and the reason is both the fixed cost and the variable costs are falling. There comes a funny little bit in the middle where the average fixed cost is still falling and the average variable starts to turn up, but it doesn't offset those falls in the fixed cost. So therefore the average total cost does keep falling, but not by much, and then there's a point when the average variable is rising so rapidly now the fall in the fixed cost is much smaller, and so therefore the total cost starts to turn up. So the lowest point of the total cost is here, the lowest point of the variable cost is here, and the distance between those two is actually the average fixed cost, which you can see is getting smaller. Okay, big mistake in the exam is often used when people say that the lowest point of the variable is at the same quantity as the lowest point of the total. That's not true. Okay, so the average variable is rising rapidly here, and so it's offsetting this fall in the fixed cost, causing the total to rise. Okay, so that's how you do it. But in all honesty, these are the diagrams that you need for the exam in terms of your average. Sometimes you won't even need this variable cost one. You will need, however, the total cost curve. Okay, so you've got to know the others because it comes up in multi-choice. Well, finally, let's move on to marginal costs. The law of diminishing returns is also the reason for the law of diminishing marginal returns. So here we see marginal product is rising, so therefore marginal cost is falling. When marginal product falls, marginal cost rises. Okay, and you can see it there. You have these two different areas. MP is rising, causing marginal cost to fall. So there's always the same relationship. When the marginal product, any product is rising, the cost, marginal product, marginal cost in this case, or could be averages as well, is falling. So when the product is rising, the cost is falling. When the marginal product falls, the marginal cost starts to rise. So the other thing about marginal cost, which is important to get this right when you get to the diagrams of the firms, is that the marginal cost is the change in total costs. But you can either draw it up this way, that it's the marginal cost of the nth unit, where n is the number of output. So let's say that was 50, is the total cost of 50 minus the total cost of 50 minus 1, 49. So it's the extra cost of producing one more. The better way of looking at it is that it's the change in the total cost when my quantity changes. So it's the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. But we've got to remember that the fixed costs here and the variable costs, you can divide those total costs into those two, but the fixed costs are fixed. They don't change. So the change in fixed cost, if you like, when we change our quantity is 0. We don't change our fixed costs. So the only change, the marginal cost, is only affected by changes in the variable cost. Okay, and that's really quite important, because in exams they might ask you to show the effect on a firm of an increase in wages. Well, if it's wages, it's a variable cost, and so the marginal cost and the variable cost will change. But if it's a fixed cost that is rising, okay, as I say, they can rise, it's just they don't rise with output. But let's say, you know, your admin costs go up by 20%, then you only shift the fixed cost curve, or the total costs, or the average cost, and you don't change the marginal cost. Okay, so you'll see that later on, and it'll be clearer later on, I hope, for you. Okay, so the marginal costs only reflect changes in variable costs. So in the end, diagram you're going to need is this one. So average total cost goes down, turns up, average variable down, up, and the marginal cost down, up, but it must hit the variable and the total at the lowest point. And that's the diagram that you're going to need to take into the exam with you. And even then, sometimes you won't need the variable cost. Okay, so hopefully that's given you an overview. It's a long video, quite complicated, I know, but just make sure that you can get those costs sorted out, and you can draw particularly this diagram, and all the other ones are just needed for multiple choice work. Okay.